People with ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are typically regarded as just your average daydreamer, but what many people don't realize is that the iceberg goes a lot deeper than that. On a molecular level, ADHD is characterized by neurochemical imbalances in the prefrontal cortex, a region of the brain that is responsible for long-term planning, decision-making, working memory, personality expression, and moderating social behavior. More specifically, their brain is dopamine deficient in this area. For context, dopamine is the chemical in your brain responsible for regulating pleasure, motivation, and behavioral reinforcement. So when you engage in activities that release dopamine in your brain, such as talking to your crush or making a lot of money, it feels good and this behavior is reinforced, making it more likely that you're going to engage in it in the future. The reason why people with ADHD have low dopamine in their brain is because they have a high level of something called a dopamine transporter. And what dopamine transporters do is they essentially wash the dopamine out of your brain. So higher levels of transporters means lower levels of dopamine left over. This in turn makes it so that people with ADHD are naturally drawn towards high dopamine activities because their brain clears it out so quickly that low dopamine activities, such as reading and studying, don't provide them adequate stimulation to feel like rewarding and worthwhile behaviors. Because their brains are drawn towards satisfying this deficiency, they're much more susceptible to addiction and may experience more negative emotion than those who don't have it. But that's a story for another video. When you understand what stimulant medications do, it starts to become very clear why they're used to treat ADHD. There are two branches of stimulant medications worth discussing, known as methylphenidates and amphetamines. They both work by increasing the levels of dopamine in the brain, but do so through different mechanisms of action. Methylphenidate, which is more commonly known as Ritalin, works by targeting the dopamine transporters, the molecules that wash dopamine out of your brain. What it does is it blocks them, making it so that they're no longer able to function properly. Now, the dopamine can't be swept out of your brain, allowing for higher concentrations to build up naturally on their own. A good analogy is picturing your brain as a sink and the dopamine in your brain as the water. Now, say the sink is left on a trickle. The water is going to drain quicker than it can accumulate, and so what methylphenidate does is it acts like a drain plug, allowing that slow trickle to accumulate into a basin full of water. And so now the brain is saturated with dopamine. Once the brain is saturated, it's no longer in a deficient state, and so the impulse to seek out high dopamine activities is diminished, making it easier to concentrate on things that they once had no interest in. Amphetamines, more commonly known as Adderall or Vyvanse, act in a slightly different manner than methylphenidates do. Amphetamines completely block the dopamine transporters in the brain, while also forcing your brain to release more dopamine than it normally would. Again, back to our sink analogy, this would be like putting the drain plug in the sink, but now turning the faucet on to a full blast. And so amphetamines are the more powerful of the two stimulants. Both families of drugs also work to increase the effects of norepinephrine in the brain, which is essentially adrenaline but for the mind. Norepinephrine is thought to play a large role in the body's stress response and also helps regulate levels of alertness. So increasing levels of it in the brain has the potential to improve symptoms like inattention, impulse control, and memory problems. But at the same time, norepinephrine is thought to be the culprit of causing the negative side effects of these medications, like anxiety, increased heart rate, and high blood pressure. But everyone's brain and body is different, and for some people, methylphenidates actually feel stronger than amphetamines. And so relying on the advice of other people on how to treat your ADHD with medication is often a bad idea, because what's right for one person could be totally wrong for someone else. That's why it's important to seek out advice from a doctor or a therapist and gain personal experience about what works for you, not what works for other people. So now we know ADHD is caused by a dopamine deficiency, but what causes this dopamine deficiency in the first place? There's lots of evidence to support the idea that it's genetic and that people with ADHD are born that way. But one possible theory that I thought was interesting that was proposed by Gabor Mate, a Canadian-Hungarian physician, is that ADHD is a defense mechanism that develops as a result to being exposed to trauma as a child or an infant. His theory is that babies are so defenseless, but they absorb the energy around them like a sponge. So if a child's parents are fighting and exposing them to a large amount of stress at a very young age, there's nothing the baby can do except for tune it out and ignore it. And so this becomes the child's defense strategy. But when they grow up, it sticks around with them. And so anytime they experience stress in their life, their brain reverts to the old coping mechanism of tuning it out because they've implicitly been trained to deal with stress in that manner. Personally, I don't think this is the case for everybody, but I definitely think it's a valid argument for many people. So digging into the past with a therapist could actually be very useful for someone with ADHD, because they might be able to dig up memories that they thought were insignificant, but actually play a critical role in their inability to concentrate on things that matter to them. And as for anything, discovering the problem is the first step of solving the problem. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Maybe you learned something new. If you like this kind of content and want to see more of it, then subscribe, because that's all I do here on this channel. And thank you all for watching.